Good morning. I want to talk about something today that it may seem like I'm a little late in talking about this because it was just 2 days ago that the whole world, it seems, was recognizing the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. And so in some ways this may seem like a little bit late, but the truth is that this subject is really never late. It's never out of place. It is the most significant thing we can talk about, and that is because the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the most significant event in the history of the world. Now, I want to talk about the resurrection today, and I want to tell you some reasons why we know that the resurrection actually happened. And then tomorrow I want to give some additional facts that need to be inserted into this story as we pull this story from the New Testament, some things that we need to look at to help have a confirmation of this. So it's an important thing for us to talk about. Next week, actually, I want to talk about the immediate reverberations of this event. What happened immediately? I mean, like starting the very next day. What happened to those disciples who had been following Jesus, and what was their reaction to the resurrection? Putting all this together is a wonderful affirmation of our faith. So why are we talking about this? Is this not just a fact of what Christianity is about and we just accept it and move on? Well, let me underscore something here to begin with. This is not just a cute little Easter story. This is the major event in the history of the world. And for us as Christians, we need to not only have a grasp of this story to great detail for the affirmation of our own faith, because sometimes our faith grows weak and we need to hear those stories. We need to be reminded of those things that have happened that convince us, that assure us that what we are following, what we are actually giving our lives for, is really worthwhile. But we are also living in an increasingly skeptical world, a world that sometimes doubts whether Jesus actually even lived. And many of them certainly doubt that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. It's a nice myth, it's a nice story, they say, but they don't really believe it as a historic event. Well, let me tell you that we can believe it. No other world religion is so focused on an event in history as is Christianity. We are focused on the resurrection more than any other event that ever happened, more than the birth of Jesus, more than even his death, because the resurrection is what makes the difference. All people are born. All people are eventually going to die. But here we have this reality of one who was resurrected from the dead. Even the Apostle Paul put the whole of his faith and the whole of our faith kind of on the chopping block, saying if you can disprove this, then you can disprove Christianity. And be assured there were a great many people at that time who were doing everything they could to destroy what Jesus had been all about. If they could simply disprove the resurrection, then the story of Jesus goes away. There were others who had come claiming to be the Son of God, others who had come claiming to be some great leader of some way, but nobody was resurrected from the dead. And so even Paul places everything on this one event. He says if the resurrection didn't take place, then we are above all people fools, because our faith is in vain and our hope is in vain. But the other side of that is, if this resurrection is real, if the resurrection is a true historic event, then Christianity is exalted to the very highest level. No other religion, no other philosophy can even come close to comparing to it. And so we look at the resurrection of Jesus. And as Christians, and I am assuming that certainly by far most people listening to this already see themselves as Christians, we still need this assurance, but we need to have this in mind and in hand so that we can talk about this intelligently to the skeptics who come along. Even our own children or our own grandchildren may someday come to us with a real question, and we need to be equipped with the facts about this story. Truth is, if Jesus was resurrected from the dead, as we are about to show, then Christianity is the superior worldview over all others. So, how do we know that the resurrection actually happened? Let me present to you 9 things very quickly that really give us an assurance that this is a historic event. Number 1, I would simply say that it is an historic event because it is supported by the testimony of witnesses. It is not just a myth that was made up, and we're going to deal with that in a second, but this was an event that happened at a real place, at a real time in history, and it was witnessed by all sorts of people. This is a historic event documented as such. If we want to prove anything happened in history, we don't prove that in the same way that we would prove something in the laboratory. We don't go through what is called the scientific method of proof because we cannot replicate this in a lab. What we have to rely on in any historic event is the testimony of the people of that time who were witnesses. And if their testimony is valid, then we know that the event is true. And so we start with this. We have a plethora of witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. Secondly, underscore this. This is not a myth. Both the apostles, Paul and Peter, they testified to the presence of myth in their time, and they said, what we're looking at now, that's not what this is. These are not cleverly devised myths by men. These are not stories that somebody made up. These are real events. And the apostles were testifying to this and showing the contrast between the myths of their day and the truth of the resurrection. Third thing is, we can trust the New Testament as a reliable historical document. There's a man by the name of F.F. Bruce, who was a British scholar, died in 1990. Interestingly, died on September 11th, 1990. Was a scholar of the highest rank, very, very respected. And he wrote a book called The New Testament, Is It Reliable? Or I guess it was the New Testament documents, Are They Reliable? And he went through in this book, and by the way, it's a little thin, fairly thin little book, but full of just amazing documentation that assures us of the historicity of those documents. These are not writings that were made up centuries later. These were writings from the first century, from people who were witnesses, or at least second-hand witnesses, both first-hand and second-hand witnesses to these events. And because of all this, we can trust the New Testament as a historically reliable document. Fourth thing, Jesus died by crucifixion. Now, here's something interesting. This is in direct contrast to what the Quran teaches. The Quran specifically says Jesus did not die by crucifixion. There are all sorts of other by stories with this, and not just the Quran, but other faith-based ideas through the centuries have tried to explain away the death of Jesus in one way or another. But this event, his crucifixion and his subsequent death, were witnessed by friends and by enemies. And we have documentation of that. And this event, the death of Jesus by crucifixion, it was confirmed by friends who buried him, because friends don't bury friends who are still alive, and by enemies whose job it was to actually kill people and to confirm that they were dead. Those Roman soldiers in charge of that crucifixion scene, they were experts at making people die and then confirming that they were dead. That was their job. And indeed, they went through the process of crucifying and then seeing Jesus die. And then there were some subsequent things that happened even at that point of Jesus on the cross that confirmed that he was dead. There was also a confirmation, a physiological confirmation, of the death of Jesus. Remember the story when the soldier stuck the spear in the side of Jesus and out came blood and water. Well, we know now that the pericardial sac that surrounds the heart is filled with a substance that is a mixture of, we would say, a mixture of blood and water, okay? But at the point of death, that blood and water begin to separate from each other. So if you have a piercing of that pericardial sac and blood and water come out separately, it is a confirmation of death. Jesus died by crucifixion, witnessed and confirmed by friends, by enemies, and by physiological evidence. Fifth thing, he was sealed in a tomb by what is called in Scripture a very large stone. By the description of what we have and by the history of crucifixions, not just crucifixions, but of death and burial at the time in the first century in that culture, it is pretty much an assured thing that that stone weighed between 1.5 and 2 tons, certainly not easily moved. But it was put in place not to be tampered with, but to be put eventually as a permanent seal. Now, the fact is that they had to do kind of a temporary job because the burial process could not be finished. They didn't have enough time on that Friday before Sabbath began to finish the process. But they were coming back on the first day of the week. That's what the women were doing on that first day of the week when they came back to finish the burial process. And I'm assuming that they were going to ask the soldiers that were there to help them move the stone or to move the stone. And so it was sealed by a very large stone. Tomorrow we're going to talk about what actually happened to that stone. But that tomb was sealed, and not only by the size of the stone, but by a Roman seal that itself physically was not very strong, but politically was powerful. And so the tomb was sealed, again, witnessed by friends and enemies. And then there was the Roman guard. In our storybook pictures, we have usually have 2 soldiers wearing something that looks more like a Greek honor guard than anything else, certainly looking more Greek than it does like a Roman soldier. But this group of Roman soldiers was sent. By the language that is used, we can know that that guard was probably between 4 and 16 and probably tending towards the higher number of soldiers that were set to guard that tomb and were ready for any eventuality except for the truth of what actually happened. They were not ready for resurrection. But there was the Roman guard. And then the tomb was empty, testified to by friends and enemies. They didn't have much of an explanation, except when Peter and John ran to the tomb. Peter abruptly ran into the tomb and saw the grave clothes there empty. And at that point, they believed, says Scripture. Simply by the laying of those empty wrappings, they were convinced Jesus was resurrected. And then there were the witnesses. Jesus was, as he was resurrected and he came out, I'm assuming that the very first witnesses were probably those Roman soldiers. And then there were the women who came to the tomb. And then later on that day, Peter had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, as did also two of the disciples who were on their way to Emmaus as they walked with the resurrected Jesus. And then that evening, Jesus appeared to the remaining of what was the 12, with the exception, obviously, of Judas, was not there because he was dead, and Thomas was not there. But I'm assuming that at least the majority of the rest of them, probably 10, were gathered together, and Jesus appeared to them. They had seen him alive, they saw him dead, and now they're seeing him alive again. The Scripture also tells us that at one point 500 people witnessed him alive. And then finally, there were the attempts to cover up the story. They couldn't explain it away, and so they made up a story, and the Scripture tells us about that. There were other stories that came down through the ages that Jesus was not really dead, but the evidence doesn't support that. That there was some other reason why all this happened. The evidence supports the fact that Jesus was alive, and then he was dead, and then he was alive again. He was truly resurrected from the dead. Now, we stop here at this point for today, but be assured, Christian, this story, this is the central story of our life, of all the history of the world. Jesus was resurrected, and in trusting that and in knowing about this, we can also tell others the story as well. It's a terrific story, and we're going to continue with this tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye.
They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Words of life, words of hope.